Today I'm working in my Strathmore visual journal to create an art journal page, and to create the background I'm starting with some Neo Colour 2s by Caran d'Ache. The colours I've chosen are Bordeaux and Royal Blue, and I'm just applying them to an ungessoed page in their dry form, and later I'm going to blend them through with some golden fluid acrylic in titanium white. Once I'm happy with the amount of pigment on the page from the Neo colours, I'm starting to blend them with the white paint. I've chosen to activate the pigment with acrylic rather than water because I want to create a very muted pastel effect. Adding white paint this way also achieves a creamy, more blended outcome which is not obtainable when using water. Next, I want to add some elements of interest to my background, so I'm beginning here with a lace stamp by Stampin' Up, and I'm using Archival ink to stamp with in Cornflower Blue. And I've chosen Archival ink because it's suitable for a non-porous surface, such as over the acrylic paint in this instance, and it's also permanent once dry, therefore additional layers of wet media can be added without distorting the images. As well as the stamping, I want to add some torn pieces of pattern paper, and for this I've chosen a paper by Prima from their Princess collection. I'm tearing the paper to reveal a white edge. This will help it blend more easily into the background, and also the exposed white edge will serve to take colour more easily in the next step of the project. Once I'm happy with the placement of the torn paper, I'm using Matte Medium by Golden to adhere them to my page. Now I'm taking the same Bordeaux colour that was used in the background to outline the pieces of torn paper, and then I'm going to blend those with some titanium white in the same manner that I did the background at the start. And here I'm using the acrylic paint in titanium white as before, and then I'm using my fingers to push the colour out into the background so that it gradually fades away from that torn paper image. Now I'm using a stamp set by Paper Artsy, and I've chosen the bottle image from this Hot Picks plate. I'm using the Archival ink again in Cornflower Blue, and I'm stamping a row of the same image along the bottom of this journal page. Now I've chosen another Paper Artsy plate. This is JOFY 14, and again I'm using the Cornflower Blue, but this time I'm stamping it first on some scrap paper so that the impression is much lighter. And the reason for this is that later in the project I want to almost cover those stamped lines with paint. And what's nice about these stamps is that you can manipulate the heads of the flowers and the stems so that they're facing different directions, and that way it doesn't look like you've just used one or two stamps for your project. It looks like you've got an array of different images. Manipulating the flowers in this way really helps with composition, and it makes your piece appear more natural and realistic. And here are all the flowers that I've stamped. I do add a couple more later actually, but for now these are the ones that I thought I was happy with. And all of those stamps are from that same JOFY plate from Paper Artsy. So now I've gone back to the Bordeaux Neo colour and I'm starting to add some colour onto the petals of these flowers, and I'm mixing it with a little bit of the white paint as I go, so I still get that creamy pastel effect that I was looking to achieve on the background and overall really for this piece. Now I decide that the very tips of the petals need to be a little bit brighter, so I've chosen Quinacridone Magenta by Golden. This is a transparent fluid acrylic, but it does brighten up those petals just slightly, so the flowers are going to pop more off the background and become more of a feature. And now I go back to the titanium white to blend those colours together, and I do this several times, picking up some of the magenta and then going back to the white and then magenta again, just so it's blended to a point where I'm happy with the colour intensity on the edges and how muted and creamy it is towards the centre of the flower. Now I'm going to colour the centre of the flowers using exactly the same method as before. So this is orangish yellow neo colour and then blending it with some white acrylic paint. And I'm taking care here to try and blend out some of those stamped lines. So you'll see later in the project when I've gone over this several times that the lines start to disappear. Now I'm going to add some colour to the little bell type flowers, and for this I'm using royal blue, which was the same colour neo that was used at the start of the project in the background, and once again it's been blended with some white acrylic paint, and this really is just a base coat. I'm not really worrying too much about shading or anything at this point. And now I'm continuing to add colour to the remaining flowers using the same techniques. Now I want to add some colour to the flower stems, so for this I've selected an Inktense pencil by Derwent and the colour is Spring Green. I could have used one of the Neo colours for this, but the fact that the stems are so slender made me decide to use a pencil instead because the tip is so much finer. And I'm activating the colour in the Inktense pencil in exactly the same way that I did with the Neos. I'm using some white acrylic as well as some water. Next, I want to work on the bottles, and I'm going over the archival ink that I stamped them with using some white acrylic paints, the same as I've been using throughout, and this is just giving them a more muted appearance. I did notice when I was doing this as well that the archival ink actually smudged a little bit, which is unusual because archival is a permanent ink. I'm not sure whether that's something that's unique to this particular colour, but it's definitely something I've not experienced before. However, it complemented the overall appearance of the bottles, so it was actually a happy accident. A little bit later, whilst I'm painting the bottles, you'll see that the Inktense pencil also runs a little bit whilst I'm painting over areas that were not previously activated with water, and I was expecting this and I wasn't too bothered about it, since if the bottles were actually glass you'd probably have some green reflection in those stems anyway, so it just added to the realism. Next, I'm using some Prisma Color Pencils to start adding some definition to the flowers. So I'm starting here with a white pencil to add highlights, and then later you'll see that I take some other colours to start refining the detail. Here I'm taking several colours to brighten up the centre of the daisy type flowers and to add a little bit more contrast on them. So I start by outlining the flowers with an orangey yellow colour, and as I'm doing so I'm dragging some of that colour down into the petals to make it look more realistic, and once I've dragged some of the colour down I'll spread that out along the length of the petals a little bit using the white pencil. Now I'm going to repeat the process of defining the blue flowers using Prisma pencils. So I'm using the violet blue to begin with, and then I'm going to use violet as well and a little bit of white. Now I'm using Neo Colour 2 by Caran d'Ache in the colour Payne's Grey, and this is to add a border around the page. So to begin with, I scribble the colour around the page, and then I'm going to use a baby wipe to soften and activate that colour. Now I'm adding some Prussian blue Neo Colour over the Payne's Grey, and this is because I felt the Payne's Grey was a little bit too grey and it needed to complement the rest of the blue colours on the page more. I also used the Prussian blue to ground the bottles so that they look like they sat on a shelf and not floating in the middle of the page. Now I'm going to work on the bottles and start to add some depth and shading to those. So to start with, I'm using a very thin pencil by Prisma, and this is the violet blue, and this is to give definition to the bottles on the shadow side. Now I've switched to Pan Pastels, and this is phthalo blue, which I'm using to soften the border a little bit and extend it further into the page, and I also use this to start adding more shading to the bottles. Now that I'm happy with the border, I'm switching my attention to the bottles and using the same phthalo blue Pan Pastel to start adding some shadows, and I also use this in combination with a violet Pan Pastel. I'm using the same combination of Pan Pastel colours to add some shadows to the ground, and then I'm switching to a Hansa yellow to pull in some warmer colours into the bottles, so it looks a little bit more realistic and it's reflecting colours from the stems and from other areas of the page. Now I'm going back to the JOFY stamp set and I'm stamping the quote just onto some plain white cardstock. This is 160 GSM, and I'm cutting that out and adhering that using golden matte medium. I might also add here that it's not generally a good idea to add a wet medium when you've used Pan Pastels unless you've fixed them first. In this case I was very aware of that, so I was being extra careful around areas where I knew the pan pastel was, so trying to keep it away from the top of the border and then not brushing over it too much on the bottles either. Now I'm adding some colour to the quote, so I'm using orangish yellow neo colour, which is one of the colours that was used on the flowers, so I know it's going to complement the rest of the page. And I'm just going around the outside of the quotes, although I am actually going to colour it completely. That is actually enough pigment just on the outside. I'm using a paintbrush that is loaded with very dilute white acrylic, and it's so dilute because I don't want to obliterate those words, I still want to be able to read them. Now I'm taking a magenta pan pastel and I'm outlining the quote with that, and then I'm also going to drag some of that magenta colour into the bottles so it's reflected in several areas of the page. So there's magenta on the quote, magenta on the flower petals, and also reflected in the bottles. And that was the last step of the project, so here is the finished page. I hope you enjoyed watching. As always, there will be a link to the full product list in the video description, and there you will also find my social media links.